different topics. And let's see if I'm sharing. Can you see that first slide all right? Perfect. So generally engaging volunteers in stream planting projects, both in the moment of doing the planting and in terms of stewardship. So I have packed this presentation full of too many words, and I hope that it will serve as a resource for you to go back and revisit. I've included some checklists of what I try to do to prepare in the weeks leading up to a planting, and then also some documents like waivers and training materials that we use for volunteers who offer to come back and steward some of the sites that we've planted in the past. So I'll be going really quickly, but again, I just wanted to pack it with information so you can use it as a reference. So like I said before, I'm from the Winooski Natural Resources Conservation District. We serve Chittenden and Washington counties and 3 towns in Orange County, so loosely following the boundaries of the Winooski watershed. And our goal is to promote the wise use, sustainable development, and conservation of our district's natural resources. And planting trees for streams has been a flagship program of the district for many, many years. And more often than not, we try to incorporate volunteers into plantings when we can. And this is because it's so beneficial to build visibility for your organization's work, to educate the public about the importance of riparian zones, to build community and maybe build some friendships between participants at events, and also playing that long game to add people to your newsletter, to maybe recruit new board members or people to be involved in other projects. And often you can also count volunteer hours towards grant matching funds. So there's a lot of benefits, but there's also the cost of all the staff time that you need to put in to recruit and train volunteers who will be effective at planting trees. One thing to consider is that volunteers may not be as efficient or detail-oriented as a professional crew. So in some cases, like if there is a requirement for the percentage of trees that need to survive at a site, you might consider using a professional crew instead. And an issue that I ran into this year more than any before is that volunteers might not show up to your event. And so to try to sort of have a fail-safe against that, I always try to recruit at least 20% more time and people power than I think I will need. These are 2 important numbers when you're thinking about volunteers. I've talked with other people from organizations, including Katie, who have done lots of plantings, both with professional crews and volunteers. And it's sort of agreed upon that the average person can plant about 10 trees an hour in good conditions. So that can be a great baseline when you're starting to think about how many people you need to pull off a successful volunteer planting project. And when you're writing grants, this can be a useful tool. This organization, Independent Sector, every year evaluates the value of a volunteer hour. And this year they've set it at $28.54, which might be higher than you've been writing into your grants before. So if you are accounting for match and calculating how many people you're planning to recruit, definitely pop that number in there because their time is valuable. So I'll start to go through what I think about when I'm doing volunteer tree planting. And the prep work starts 2 to 3 or maybe even more months before the event. And this is a big lesson learned for me from this year, which is it is critical to visit the site and dig a few holes so that you know what the soil type is and what the working conditions will be. If the soil is really rich in clay, the work will be significantly slower, digging the holes, and then also the time that it spends to actually break up and like crumble the soil back in. If there's really dense grass that you're dealing with and you haven't been able to pre-treat it like Katie had suggested, again, that will really change how you estimate how many volunteers you need for your project. So once you've assessed the site and figured out how many volunteers you need, maybe how many days you need to make the project happen, then you can set a date and a time. And we flip-flopped between weekday and weekend plantings, and I think they each have their pros and cons. A weekday planting obviously lends itself well to working with school groups or working with corporate groups, where weekend planting, you might get more individuals from the community, families, or volunteers from conservation commissions or other community groups. So it kind of depends on who you'd like to target that outreach and educational component to. And so then you'll go ahead and start recruiting volunteers. Sometimes I recruit 2 or 3 months in advance. Sometimes I recruit 2 or 3 weeks in advance, and I've oftentimes had equal success with both of those timeframes. So either doing direct outreach to those partners or popping newsletters or front porch forum blurbs out in the world have all been very helpful. And I cannot recommend highly enough having people RSVP so that you really know that you're going to have the people power that you need, especially if you're just relying on individuals from the community as opposed to a more committed large group. This is some sample volunteer recruitment text that I'll put out on Front Porch Forum. And I want to highlight this middle section where I share exactly what to expect. So I ask people or let them know, volunteer tasks include digging holes, planting saplings, and carrying 5 to 20 pounds of materials on up to a quarter mile of uneven terrain. So I think this makes sure that, volunteers come ready and knowing what to expect and makes the event more accessible and lets people have a little more predictability around what will be happening. These are the questions that I asked on the registration form. And again, I'll let you read this in your own time, but I just get people's name, email, where are they from, how many shifts will they be able to attend? And then the key question at the bottom, can we add you to our email list? Maybe someone's interested in the planting and then something comes up and they can't attend. But now if they've said you can add them to your email list, maybe they'll come to a future planting so you don't lose out on that opportunity to still connect. 3 to 4 days before the event, I like to email those volunteers and remind them of the project location, the time, what to bring. And I've recently started asking that if they can't come, that they find a substitute, either a friend, a neighbor, someone else who could come in their place, because that will save a lot of time for you. A day before the event, you're going to start packing your supplies, your buckets, shovels. Fun fact, I can fit almost 500 trees in the back of my Prius with the seats folded down. So, start to get that ready. And then these are the things that I always have a checklist to make sure I'm bringing as shared volunteer resources. So gloves, sunscreen, bug spray, a med kit, and some extra water. On the day of the event, I find it really important to arrive at least an hour early so that depending on where the site is, you can place signs to direct volunteers from the parking area to where you are, to make a little greeting station for folks that might trickle in late with waivers, med kit, things like that. To flag the perimeter of the planting area, if that's helpful. And then also, like Katie said, to stage those buckets with water and to distribute your species so that when people show up and they're excited and they're ready to go, you can really take advantage of their time, train them as quickly as possible, give them a bucket, and get them to work. I also like to pre-dig a hole so that I can demonstrate planting technique without sort of fumbling and having people watch me take too long to dig a hole for demonstration. And also, if you're planning to flag your trees before planting them, which can sometimes be helpful, flag a few to demonstrate the technique, and then you'll probably find a volunteer who's maybe lower energy that day who would be happy to flag the rest. Then I try to offer a 10-minute or less training to volunteers. And this can be hard because sometimes you want to go on about, intro to your organization, what's the importance of planting trees, making sure they know to avoid things like poison ivy and wild parsnip and to be aware of ticks. But really, the most important part is to talk about how to plant a tree well, to make sure the hole is dug wide enough so the roots aren't crowded, to make sure you're breaking up those clods of dirt before you're depositing them back into the hole, making sure they're pressing the soil in firmly enough so that there's good root to soil contact, and then doing that little tug test to make sure that the tree is well seated in the ground. And it can be tempting to try to encourage people to plant as fast as possible, especially if you're short on hands, but quality over quantity is so important. If you're taking the time to plant this tree at all, it's better to plant it right and have it succeed than to plant 20 trees and have them all done somewhat sloppily. I also teach people how far apart to space the trees. So usually I say about 1 shovel's length apart. And then tell what tasks need to be done and let people self-assign what feels good. This is my little pitch about why we plant trees. In short, for wildlife, to prevent erosion, to help the tree move and flow over time, and to provide shade so that the water can hold more oxygen for animals. And I also have some reference printouts here that you can use that I will actually physically bring to make sure people know what poison ivy looks like, what wild parsnip looks like, and then some handouts about being tick smart and what they should do to detect when they get home. And really what should be at the front of your mind on planting day is building investment. So these people have shown up, they're excited about this project and maybe about your organization. And I think it's most important for a project manager to float around the site and start up conversations with participants, to really get to know them, deliver tools, make sure the day is running smoothly, and just connect with them on a personal level so that hopefully they'll come back for another volunteer session in the future. If you have swag like t-shirts or stickers, that's always great to provide as a thank you. Make sure folks are joining your newsletter if they can, and then encourage them to share their experiences with friends, or encourage them to come back and visit their trees if their trees are on public land, and maybe even enroll in the stewardship program if you have one set up. So this is sort of how we gather, just a simple spreadsheet, who's volunteering for us. So we keep a list of their names, towns they're from, and then I break that down by county so that I can target, geographically appropriate people if I'm asking for help. Keep a list of their email and then how we know them. So anytime there's a volunteer opportunity, I send it to my list of people who've worked with us before. Now I'm at 10 minutes and I would love to blast through information I have about the stewardship program, but I want to double check if that is okay before I do it.
We're looking good on time, so if you want to do that, I think that would be great.
Okay, it's shorter than the first section, I promise. So this has been sort of an experiment with the Winooski district in the past couple of years, and we're still experimenting with what works, but we tried to set up our program so that people can visit sites that we've planted previously and help us collect an inventory of how the trees are doing, which ones are surviving, and also help with some of that manual removal of bindweed and doing some other maintenance activities. This has been really beneficial because people can sign up any time of the year, they can create their own schedule, they can be trained remotely, and whatever level of expertise or commitment they bring is helpful because it's always better to have more eyes out in that field. Some limitations are that they may not be tree ID experts. So again, depending on the accuracy of the data that you need to collect, you can consider whether it's appropriate. And we've also limited this program to plantings on publicly accessible land, although I know there are some partners in the eastern part of the state that are actually working to create some MOUs with private landowners to allow volunteers to come do some stewardship work as well. So it's something to consider. So what I've done is made a map of all of our planting sites that we've done in the past, maybe 10 years. And I've color coded them so that I know which ones are publicly accessible and therefore available for someone to adopt. And whenever someone reaches out looking for a volunteer program, I'll have a short list of sites that they might be interested in. And then I'll just change the color once that site has been taken. This is something individuals can sign up to do in their own time, or you might recruit. This was the Conservation Commission and the Williston Master Naturalists were looking for a one-day project. So we actually had about 10 people out in the field. Some people were doing the survival inventory, some people were sweeping for trash, other people were weeding and removing bindweed. So this is something you could do as sort of a long-term volunteer commitment or as a single day activity. This is what the training sheet looks like that I'll share with a new site adopter. So I'll share the site name, what to bring, and then a little bit of homework. So I'll actually provide them with a detailed map of the site showing where to park, where to walk, and then where the trees are located, and trying to make sure this is as clear as possible because I don't always go out in the field to meet them and show them around. Then I'll share the tree inventory of which species were planted there, and if any of them have tubes, which might make them more identifiable, which ones had tubes and which ones didn't. And then have a spreadsheet here where they can note any issues, whether the trees are alive or dead, and any damage they've noticed. And then just some notes about site maintenance and how they can report their hours once they come back. Usually when I share about volunteers, people want to see our waiver. So this is our waiver. You're welcome to copy it and use it if it's useful to you. And then I created a Google sheet that tracks tree stewardship volunteer hours by site. So just kind of asking how many hours did you spend there and then what tasks did you complete so that we're able to get a good picture of how much sites are getting love and how frequent of a basis. So again, it's still sort of a trial pilot project, but I'm really excited about the idea of getting people invested in going back to this site year after year and, doing whatever it is they can to help these trees that we put so much time and effort and investment into to really help them to survive and thrive. So please feel free to reach out to me with any questions, and thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you so much, Kristen. I know that I asked you the impossible of covering so many topics in such a short amount of time. So really, truly appreciate how much you were able to share with us in this very brief amount of time. Does anyone have any questions for Kristen before we take a break?
I do, because I always do. Kristen, I'm a little curious about what your breakdown of past tree plantings on private versus public lands is. It sounds like you have a lot of public tree plantings, and I believe that like our district has mostly been private lands.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think maybe 30 to 40% on public land, because we do have a good relationship with the Missisquoi Valley Parks District, and they've been wanting to do a lot of riparian plantings. But definitely a significant amount on private. So I think the big opportunity will be figuring out how to pitch the idea of having some volunteer stewards come onto privately planted project lands.
Thanks.
I have a question if no one else does. I'm curious how you contact corporate groups to be volunteers. Do you know beforehand? Are they mostly groups that you've worked with in the past, or do you just sort of blindly reach out to some groups? Like, do you get an idea beforehand of whether they might be interested? Just a little curious about that, because it seems like a really good way to recruit volunteers.
It does, and I don't have personal experience doing it. Actually, the reason I included them is because our partners at Friends of the Winooski River very frequently work with Sun Common, and I think also Seventh Generation. So maybe you could ask Michelle Braun a little bit more about that. I think probably reaching out directly, though, to whatever sort of large, maybe ecologically minded corporations that are looking for some good press in your area, I think it will be fruitful, because it's such a photogenic activity that, if they have a volunteer program and if they are looking for that press, like, you can get a lot of work done really fast, and it provides them with that opportunity they're looking for to get workers, photographed out in the field doing the good work.
Great, thanks.
Another question. Do you use any volunteer management software, or is it mostly Google Forms for registration and then spreadsheets and things?
Yeah, that would be such a dream. We should write a grant to get some at some point. But at this point, it's all just my own brain creating Excel spreadsheets that are physically updated. But if the software is out there, and it would be smart. Maybe we could go in as a coalition at some point, or try to do a pilot project, to see if it works well for a few organizations and justify that investment in the future.
Mm-hmm. And just sharing networks too, because if everyone is doing tree planting, then, your volunteers for one organization would be interested in volunteering for another organization too. But
yeah, on a recruiting note, I'm curious about what your success rate, or like how many folks you're able to get when you recruit through Front Porch Forum.
Front Porch Forum is the best recruiting tool by far, in my opinion. I think some of the most engaged people in the community are those reading it, and it just gets in front of so many more eyes than your own little social media bubble or your own newsletter. So yeah, I think Front Porch Forum has far and away been our best recruiting tool.
That's awesome to hear. Sarah, you have a question, or your hand is up.
Yeah, I love seeing this presentation. Every time I see this, Kristen, I think it's great. It's so awesome that you do this. And I'm sure I've asked you this question before. How do you support your time to manage this volunteer effort?
That's a great question too. At this point, we decided that it would be a priority for the district, so we're using general funds for it. We do have a few grants that require us to go back and revisit sites to assess survivorship, but I don't feel that volunteers necessarily have the training and expertise to do that to the quality levels that I'm looking for. So I've actually done that myself with interns. And I think we've just invested time in building the volunteer program because we think it will reap those other benefits of getting people more invested, maybe purchasing some items from the tree sale in the future, maybe hopefully becoming a board member or supporting us in another way. So it's been sort of a slow progression. And I think it would be stronger if we had more funding and support. but we have just taken it on ourselves at this point.
Do we have any other questions before we take a break? All right.